All the roads are winding.
What are you wanting to talk about today, Shawna?
I'm wanting to dive into the early history of anthropology and just some little tidbits that stuck out to me in regards to how ideologies have began shifting and how they shifted over time to get us to where we are now. And not too in depth, but I think it's interesting and plays into the conversation we've been having around finding safety and finding safety within oneself so that you can also find safety within community.
All right. And what even is anthropology and what's an ideology?
Well, um, well, I'll start with what an ideology is. An ideology is a school of thought, and we all have an idea of how things are, how we perceive them to be, but then there's how it actually is. And we won't get into the nuances of all of that, but we inherit ideologies from our upbringing, and we inherit ideologies from the communities that we embed ourselves in. And so a lot of discourse in the media and obviously like intertwined with that politics um, are all influenced by ideology. Everything has been influenced by these ideologies that we all have. And that's also what informs, how we vote and how we show up. So I find it helpful to analyze the beginning of how ideologies became ideologies and understanding what influenced them and how these like major schools of thought that are embedded into the infrastructure of globally, but also the United States and the United States political system.
Very cool. Would you say that an ideology is the model that someone makes to interpret reality and to navigate in reality, but we're never actually in reality, except that might be what someone would call like super consciousness is when you are actually tapped. I don't know, where that gets metaphysical.
That's a really good question, and it could be metaphysical. But I'll try to keep it earth-based today in terms of like an ideology in relation to how I am studying it and thinking of it is, well, they are many, many thoughts, if you will, that is carried out in like a larger construct. So,
Okay, wait, what's a construct for folks?
okay, so a construct is kind of a framework, like what we follow, but constructs are usually like, they're invisible. It's not like a framework that you follow a protocol in like school, like this is how you do this lab procedure. It's just so deeply embedded. So an example of a construct I would argue is race. um Race is as a thought, um it's invisible. People created race as divisible lines by the color of skin, or cultural classification. So it's helpful to understand how racism has manifested and is executed and embedded to boil it down to, okay, what are the ideologies driving race today? Like racism. So I'm also specifically talking about um, racism. So the active practice of discriminating against somebody because the color of their skin or cultural classification. So yeah, I don't want to get too in the weeds, but
Yeah, and like that, I think this is interesting. And if someone's listening and they have a question or something's not quite clear, they can ask us because that can prompt us to discuss something deeper or further or unpack it. And this is an exploratory conversation. So yeah. And one thing about it, like race is a thought. It's not something that exists. Like it's a thought that people created to explain why people were different or why they were the same. And it's not like, how is that, is that what you mean? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. And I'll back up here because I also think it's important for me to share the context and, I guess, landscape of where I come from. I am mixed race and I'm also multicultural. I don't present how people think I should. And therefore, I spent a lot of my life being told how I should be, being mixed with African American and Native American and white, and not just, um, Caucasian, but like whiteness from formerly enslaved ancestors. So there's all of this, like, I feel turmoil inside of me in terms of like how I identify, and it's led to a lot of like identity crises, low, very, very low self-worth, not really understanding where I fit, who are my people, who can I turn to. I was and we do have some episodes I think going into this, but being raised to identify myself as a Black woman, when I present very, I guess, I'm very white assuming. People assume that I'm white based on my phenotypical appearance. Even though I do look a lot like my dad, I also look like my mother, who is this Germanic woman with very fair skin and red hair. But I have siblings who are mixed race too, and none of us present in the same way. So I grew up talking to my siblings about their struggles, and they have a whole different type of experience than I have. And so I'm also recognizing that while I do consider myself now, Black but mixed race, and I say that because culturally I was raised Black, um, and understanding why my parents raised me to identify as a Black woman. Their reasoning was because, well, Jim Crow, the one job rule. And it wasn't until that I started studying anthropology from the lens of how to deconstruct race, because it never really made sense to me. There's always this point of confusion. And realizing, okay, so they want me to identify as this Black woman because some legal political system said if you have any amount of Blackness in your ancestral lineage, you're Black. And then understanding from that point, that system was created to keep anyone with any amount of Blackness oppressed from being able to move along. Why are we still supporting that school of thought? So that was, that was my initial thought. And so I started digging into that more, of like, okay, wait, race is literally created by men, literally created by white men in power. And how do we undo it? Where do we go from here? Because how I'm told to identify, and the only ways that society allows me to identify, which every mixed race person in America understands the check all that apply box, is so frustrating. But I got to this point of understanding that we are all 99, and this is scientific. I studied this in biological anthropology, but we're 99.99% the same. And that little percent that we're different has nothing to do with how we appear, our skin color is. Like, we evolved over time based on migration patterns. And our bodies are very cool in the way that they produce or do not produce melanin to protect from UV rays, so that we can continue on as a race of one race, human the human race. Um, and so really understanding how these different um, justifications, I will call it, for race in America, in the US, the very rigid types of racial classification that we exist in, um, I find that helpful to really understand and know so that we can move towards a true multicultural society. I don't believe that a true multicultural society actually exists yet because the term melting pot means assimilation. Like melting pot literally is it's like this historically there's this cartoon that was created around the time the term melting pot started really generating, which is like all these different cultures going into a melting like a pot, like a witch's cauldron, if you will, and then like coming out of it like very like prim and proper according to whiteness. So a melting pot is not multicultural. A melting pot, which we do exist in America, is erasing our culture so that we are one in the way of Eurocentric American idealism. So what white people should be and act like. Um, so yeah, I have huge interest in understanding how to deconstruct racism so that we can move towards a multicultural way of existing, not erasing our cultures, embracing our cultures. I have this detachment though to race as a classification. Um, I think it's helpful to understand in community. So how can we, um, improve and make society fair and equal because of systemic racism? So understanding, how like different populations exist throughout the country, I do think that's helpful. And again, I'm saying there's like this is all something I hope to help figure out, right? Like how can we support different communities but move away from marginalization? And so that applies to all the ways that we're oppressed and all the ways that we oppress. So um, including the other than human realm.
Cool. I'm curious. There's so much. I'm like, oh, so much there. And that's just getting into defining ideologies and anthropology and constructs. Um, do you know what the 0.001% of DNA difference is? What's happening there?
So I don't know what that exact difference is. There's this really great book, which is where I learned some of this information from, is called Race in North America or Race in America. It's by something Smedley. We'll put it in the show notes. But uh, there is research done by Nina Jablonski, I believe is how you say her name, and it's called Skin Color is an Illusion. And she really goes into how like the earliest humans evolved in high UV environments because of the proximity to the equator, aka Africa. And the earliest members of our lineage, the genus Homo, were very darkly pigmented. And so she talks about how we all share this really incredible heritage of having originally been darkly pigmented over like 2 million to 1.5 million years ago. So in these early days of our evolution, looking at the equator, we were bombarded by like super, super high levels of ultraviolet uh, what is, radiation. And the UVC is the most energetic type. Uh, anyway, so that's like, not to get too scientific, but it also catalyzes the production of vitamin D in the skin. Vitamin D being a really important molecule that we need for strong bones and the health of our immune system, and like a bunch of other like really important functions that vitamin D support. And a lot of us these days lack. So melanin was recruited in our lineage and specifically in our earliest ancestors evolving in Africa to be natural sunscreen. So our bodies are, again, super cool, and it was able to protect against the degradations that happen to our skin cells because of the UVC. But then when humans started to migrate and move around and disperse all around, not once, but there were two major moves. So from Africa into parts of the old world, aka like Europe, and then into the new world here in the Americas. So as
and we're talking like a really, really, really long time ago, right?
Really long time ago. Again, like, like over 1.5 million years ago. So over time, genetic mutation occurs and skin, our skin pigment looks different based on, the parent's DNA. So this really, really, really gets into biological anthropology, which is like how do genes mutate and change, and like the whole study of evolution in a sense. So my point to that is that that's why we have different skin colors. But then, people started to be able to travel because of ships, and then they're starting to notice like all these different like beautiful colored skin tones. Colonization happens, and a myriad of things occur to where we create this classification of race. So I'm not sure where we want to jump in, but to answer your question, I don't know what that like marginal percentage is, because it's, dealing with a lot of science. Just have concluded that that difference is so very small that like it still has nothing to like, there's no proof anywhere that exists that there is a different classification of humans. We are one race. I think that's like my thesis here is
we're all the same species.
We're all the same species. We just have different skin color because of genetic mutation, evolution, and survival of the fittest. Like we have to be able to adapt to all these different
survival of the fittest is a topic I would love to get into. Oh my god.
Yeah. So just remembering that we are all animals, we all mutate and evolve, and the color of our skin and pigmentation is a result of that. So
that's cool. Right. It makes me think of the garden, and how in the garden a zinnia is a zinnia, but then there's different varieties of zinnia, and a sunflower is a sunflower, but there's different varieties of sunflower. You can have the autumn ones with the like dark petals, or you can have the frilly ones, or like the bear, I don't know, mammoth ones. And you can have all these different sunflowers, but they're all sunflowers. They're all the same species, different varieties.
Yes, I love that. The last time we talked, I think I had mentioned this caterpillar that it's a Florida native caterpillar, and it's evolved to look like bird poop so that the birds don't eat it, and their species was going extinct. Which I think is really, really cool.
So random.
I know it's super random, but the way that nature just like adapts and like grows, it's so cool. Which also just gives me hope for the future. And I just yeah, I think the more we understand, there's all this like political discourse around critical race theory, which is really relevant to me, and also what we're talking about, because it's being outlawed in elementary schools and like college level classes. So in Florida, like the way race is presented and discussed is being controlled, which is not okay. But a lot of people don't fully understand what critical race theory even is. And 9 times out of 10, like it's nothing that it actually is. So a lot of what I study could be considered critical race theory, but really it's important to understand how we got here
Yeah.
and do better in the future, do better now.
Right. Right. We didn't just wake up one day, oh, this it is. It's like this has been an evolution of itself over a long, long, long time. And that's influenced and rooted in many things, and just who we are as humans and who we aren't as humans, but who we've taken on and think how we think that's just how we are, but we aren't actually. So yeah. First of all, what is anthropology too? I don't think we talked about that. What is anthropology?
Okay, so it's a study of human behavior, um, human biology, human as it pertains to culture, societies, linguistic, in both the past and the present. And the goal is to, the goal of anthropology actually began to really justify race. So anthropology is largely a part of the problem.
So do you want to take us back to where did anthropology begin? Is there a time, is there a place that we're going to land here or begin here?
Sure, yeah. So it really kind of started in the 5th century BCE, because there was this like massive change in Greek life. And what changed?
So that's over 2,500 years ago, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Anthropology, I'm like, how do I explain this in a short? Anthropology kind of started started from schools of thought. So you have people like Plato, Socrates, a lot of these names that we've learned throughout history as it pertains to like art and philosophy and things like that. But these people are important to anthropology because they were thought leaders. So they developed these schools of thought that became embedded as ideologies in communities and like circles and in life.
And those ideologies are how humans who are born into that just assume that's just how things are. They don't even see that it's a construct it's created, where I guess I'm not 100% sure of the difference between construct versus ideology, but ideology must lead to construct or something. So we'll get into. I'll let you keep going.
Yeah. So these thought leaders, were in circles and communities, and those people in their circles and communities pick up on these ideologies, and these ideologies take off and evolve into different things depending on different purposes, right? So race, for example, the reason why anthropology is responsible, I'm going to say it, racism, is because based on some school of thought, people in oh man, there's so much to unpack, but I'm gonna talk about racism as it pertains to the United States, because that's the context in which I live in and how it's impacted me. So racism in the United States, which is the most rigid form of racism, exists because anthropologists, scientists studying human biology and culture and behavior, we're trying to justify anyone who looked Black as a subspecies to whiteness. White supremacy is what we're talking about.
Literally, their white people are better than, more evolved than, supreme to people who are not white.
Exactly.
They are not, people who are not white are not even technically people.
Right, and this is the paradox of America, is because these are the people who govern, these are the people who wrote the Constitution and the laws that continue to govern today.
Those are the ideologies that they were born into and adopted and like living.
Right. Mm-hmm. And it's why it's systemic, because it's so deeply embedded within the framework of how America operates, the United States. in our political system. And so there's so much to unravel, but you can't unravel it, and you can't unravel it in a productive way without understanding how it marginalizes everyone, right? Because if one person is oppressed in the system, we all are. So we can't get to a better tomorrow without really understanding and making those changes happen so that we don't repeat what we have. Um, and that's a whole nother conversation.
I know, I was just gonna say, can we just like, wow, like this is a probably where we're gonna be diving deeper and deeper and deeper, is that I imagine a direction that we'll just keep unpacking.
Right. And imagine how liberating it is to understand where we came from and how we got here. Imagine the guilt that people have currently, especially for lineages who are directly responsible for the implementation of racism. Um, like, I think understanding that can eliminate a little bit and help us get to a more productive place of where we can have productive conversations and implement action that really does liberate all of us, and not just living beings but other than human too, because if our ecosystem is also oppressed and capitalized and dying, we all die. So everything is connected, right? And I think that's where this whole like we are one gets a little like it really is true. Um, it's just we're not all treated as though we are. So how do we get to that?
Right. Right. Can I ask a question here about anthropology? It sounds to me like anthropology is also responsible for human supremacism, where it's saying humans are also better than nature and separate from nature. And I mean, this is something you and I talk a lot about, is human supremacy, and how, and this is what you're touching on here, of how we're saying like, oh, because we're humans and we're somehow superior to these inert objects like rocks or the water or the animals and plants or the air. Like these are in this view of human supremacy, they are less than people too.
Absolutely. And this gets into the way in which spiritual and religious ideologies have changed over time, and the colonization that has taken place there to get us to where we are currently, in these such extreme classifications of religion, to where people are fighting and trying to govern based on what others think are right in accordance to how they were raised to be and believe that things should be. So the way anthropology impacted our kinship with the other than human species is because I can't like, as far as we know and think according to historical text, we all had kinship with the land we were on, so much so that our lives were guided by it. um think back to
And depended on it. We still depend on the land. Yeah, but not much less local today.
right, and this is where we can learn so much from native cultures and like ancient cultures in relation to where anyone's ancestors came from, and go back before Christianity existed, go back before these like very like formal like schools of religious context existed. We prayed to the sun and the moon. We had a relationship with the waters. We had a relationship with the trees. We cultivated the earth. We loved the earth. We depended on the earth, and the earth depended on us. Um, and over time, schools of thought, and I can get more into that in a moment if we want to go there, but like remove that dependency, and for religious purposes, right? It was for the reason of, we're going to add a middleman between humans and greater connection to power. So whatever that is, right? Like whatever your source for, the creator, God, grandfather, creator,
What gives you life?
what gives what
What
is
protects you? Yeah.
exactly whatever that is in your life. We all had that direct connection and ability to connect. And then religion came in with humans, and humans initiated religion and power structures that said, well, no, now you have to pray through this man, right? Because it couldn't be a woman. You have to go through this man in order to reach the divine.
Well, I mean, are you speaking to Christianity specifically?
No, I'm speaking to that's like the framework that started spreading that disconnected us from our ability to connect with the divine, because between before there was the Republic and the Democratic, there was religion. There was the Catholic and the Protestant. Um, and in many places, it's still power structures are still thought based on religion.
Right, but that's just Christianity versus there's so many religions. Are they all to all is there anyone that has a middle woman or a middle non-gendered person? And that they you don't know?
I'm not a religious studies major anymore, so
Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah.
all the different things, but what I can speak to is anthropology and the study of how and when that started to shift, which was when these religious power structures started to come into play and
Do you know?
outlaw our ability to connect with nature in the way that we originally did. So,
Right.
working with herbs started be was claimed as witchcraft. And so
Right. This is like a core of the witch wound.
right, exactly. But it started so much like earlier than, the persecution of mass persecution of witches that happened. It started way, but way, way, way before then. Um, the way that we connect with the earth was being governed. Um, and how we connect was governed. So these power structures started to take form, and these power structures were based around different schools of thought that became a majority. Um, and that's how an ideology gets embedded into society, because schools of thought gets adapted by a majority of people. The majority of people say this is the way it needs to be, and no longer this other way. So let's move forward. And if you're doing it differently, then you're othered. You're not following the
You're
majority.
you're bad, you're wrong, you're gonna fail, you're gonna die, you're gonna go to hell, whatever. All the bad things.
Right. And so, um, we just keep repeating systems of othering. So we're really just talking about like really deconstructing the ways in which we're othered, and building different ways that we can coexist with our differences. And
Yeah.
in relation to like finding safety and community, and what I was thinking about and what we talk a lot about is not pushing an agenda. Is like being okay first inside of yourself, to where like you know what your boundaries are. You know what it feels like when you need to say no. You feel safe that your no is going to be respected, but you can also consent and like do that for others, and not push an agenda, and not say, if you're not the way that I think you should be based on my ideologies that I've inherited and that I'm embedded on, you're different, and like I don't want to like associate, or like you're just wrong. um yeah, so I wanted to kind of tie that all in, and talk about that, and really start to, I know this is such a broad topic and there's so many ways we can go into that, but like it really is about understanding so that we can liberate all these different aspects of our identities, and get to a sense of rootedness, to where like we can honor the safety within ourselves and honor the safety for others.
Okay, I want to go into a place that's probably going to be a little controversial to maybe to listeners. I don't know, but if one person's oppressed, we're all oppressed. And we're not advocating for change where everybody is supreme. We're advocating for change where there is no supreme. We're taking away the supreme because the supremacy makes one person or one being better than another. And this better than is in itself a fragment, a disconnect. And that disconnect itself is the wounding. And this is a wounding. I'm not going to simplify to say this is everything, but like, this is what I see happening is, okay, if someone is supreme and someone's inferior, then they're disconnected from each other. And that disconnect goes both ways and wounds both in different ways and in different proportions. Obviously, it would be easier to live as the supreme, the person who has all the privileges of supremacy, versus living as someone who is the one being, identified as inferior and being oppressed. But so I guess we could probably get into defining some terms, like what do we even mean when we say oppressed, because that is something, and maybe we don't know yet what our definition is in this conversation, because we're just exploring. This is not scripted. I did not come into this knowing exactly what we were going to talk about. You had some ideas, but we just kind of are going with the flow. Just this is just how we talk in our friendship. And so this talking about, okay, now that we have all these people listening and engaging in this conversation with us, where do we need to get more specific? What would we say? And I guess I'm getting really kind of spiraling here, because there's just like you pull one thread here and there's so many things. So I'm going to just pause and say, okay, what is your reflection or response to that?
Yeah. I think about the oppression Olympics. And this is something that my one of my professors taught, which is like the idea, if one is oppressed, we're all oppressed, is because we can't all have equality if equality isn't distributed equal. Meaning, we exist in a construct of capitalism, and because of that, and systemic racism, and like the power structures are not set up to equally distribute power. And so when groups of people have more power than another, it causes oppression. So when we talk about, how Black communities are marginalized and oppressed, it's because Black communities are oppressed in such a different way than other communities. Power structures, and again, I have to just say this, I'm talking about in the United States of America. Power structures are distributed in such a way that it makes it impossible to live and exist on equal playing fields. Like, it's not equal. It's not fair. There's no equality in that. And until we do the work to bring equality, there's oppression. And so if one person is oppressed, we're all oppressed. And oppression may feel different. It's different for the many different ways we're marginalized. But the point is, we all experience oppression differently. And so we can all sit here and say, well, I'm oppressed more than the other, and I experience this more. And so, me, my, the oppression Olympics is what she, was implying. Like, we can all try to claim to be the most, oppressed, but where is that going to get us?
They're the most supreme oppressed.
Exactly. So it's about it's about getting to a place where power is evenly distributed so that we all have an equal chance at surviving. And privilege, this word privilege that people are so afraid of, own it. If you're privileged, own it. Be happy you're privileged, because all that means is that you have more buckets of water to help put out the fire when there is one for people who don't have as many. So, like my kids are going to be privileged just by nature of not having dark skin. I'm privileged as a Black person for not having dark skin because in America of how people are treated because they look different phenotypically and because their pigment is darker. I no way in shape saying that's better, because for me it's really not. I wish I looked like my family. I wish I looked more like my community, but I am impacted by the way in which I am assumed differently. So I have greater privilege. I don't have to worry about my safety when I walk out into the street. I have to worry about my brothers. I have to worry about my sisters, but I don't. And so my privilege is doing what I can do to make sure that our streets are safe for my brothers, for my sisters, for our community. So I'm not trying to get too much into a tangent and a rabbit hole around that, but I hope that gives a little bit more clarity about what I'm talking about. If one is oppressed, we're all oppressed.
Yeah, I mean, these are such, we're swimming in it, so it can be hard to even see it and see how there can be anything but this.
Right. And when we were creating Earth Speak, like so much of this came up. And it was, for us, for our community, for everyone. Um, and, Natalie had made a comment earlier about toxic allyship and what that can look like, which is like, I feel like there's this changing of tone where, like, and actually, no, I've noticed it. I've been in circles, I've been in communities where people haven't wanted to support a business because it's run by white people. Because now, thankfully, people are waking up and realizing, like, let me be more intentional about where money is going and do what I can do to support, businesses operated and ran by people of color. But we have to be careful. And this is where that paradox comes in. Like, we have to be careful and evaluate, like, now we can't, like, be intentional, spend your money where you want to spend it, but but support everyone. Support people because of they're the best person for that job. And like, my point is, like, there's so much work to do to get us to the point where we can be productive in community. We can feel safe, because these topics, these themes kept coming up and causing blockages. And so, like, I'm glad we're starting this conversation and we're having it. Because we can make such an impact by diving deep and really unraveling to, like, re-ravel in a better and more secure way.
Right. Yeah. And I think something that we've talked about a lot, just in that idea of toxic allyship, is where someone is trying to be an ally and be supportive and fight against supremacy, but then they end up othering people and, like, recreating the system of supremacy in their allyship, in their activism. And it just keeps repeating othering, and not actually creating a new way of being that is interconnected and intersupported. I don't know if that's even a word. I just made that up, but intersupported.
Put that in the dictionary.
Yeah.
But yeah, exactly. We have to And it also comes down to listening to our bodies.
Right. I think that's a huge thing.
What's
Mm-hmm.
true for you, not what's true for your mom, your dad, your brother, your sister, your aunts, your uncles, and like your whole ancestral lineage. Like what is true for
Right.
you now, right now?
Yeah. Yeah. That's Whew. People are overriding that truth all day, every day, and then wondering why they're exhausted and miserable.
Right.
And like we kind of have to in certain places in this society because we like I who wants to contribute to like there's this repulsion of like I have to like go be part of the machine just to survive, and so there's a inherent piece that can be so hard to come to terms with, and maybe one doesn't have to come to terms with it, but yeah.
Yeah, I feel like we're like, scraping the surface of all these topics that we really, really need to dive deeper into as standalones. Like we need a whole episode on toxic allyship and what that looks like. And also like giving people a way to model, like what does this look like in practice? And
Have you seen any models? Are there any models of being that speak to you? I can speak to some I've seen, but I'm curious what's out there that gives you the glimmer of possibility.
yeah, I mean, I see a lot of modeling in terms of like how to be more sustainable, especially in gardening, as an emerging gardener and as a professional and practicing floral designer, um, in an industry that's not sustainable. There's so much waste. Being able to see what it looks like to be a floral designer, and I know this is like going a whole different way, but um like being a floral designer who only uses sustainable mechanics, it might take longer and it might cost differently, but it's better for the long run. And that's kind of what I'm learning. Like we don't have to be so quick to rush and make these decisions. Like let's talk about it. Let's like I think in any good design process there's iteration. So like what do these different ways of existing look like in iteration, and having it be more of an open dialogue of like getting to a better version of like whatever it is that you want to see in the world. But like I see it a lot in terms of like ecology in our environment. I personally don't feel like I've seen it modeled a lot in areas of discourse around race. um I think that mixed people, and right, I'm talking about from my perspective. um I think that mixed people are just now starting to kind of find a voice that's right for them. Um, and I feel like I'm just now starting to find a voice that's right for me. And I don't, I rarely have found anyone that's like speaking about this future possibility in a way that resonates. In a way that I see it, and I'm not trying to say that like I'm better. I'm trying to say that as in, if you're listening to this, who are you? Hi, introduce yourself, and like we would love to hear like what's mulling around in your thoughts. Like who are people that you're listening to and seeing and hearing in your communities that's doing work that you feel is resonant with what we're talking about. Because I would love to see models and I would love to connect like these people who are doing the work to try to come to a multicultural society and like come to the end of oppression in like all these various different ways that we experience it, um, so that we can have these conversations. You could be a guest on our show.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. And you said, ecology is a model. I think looking to nature is, to me, an inspiration of how can we have a thriving ecosystem of different beings living together, supporting each other. Like I think of the redwoods near me, and the redwood is taking in more oxygen than the tiny lizard, but it's not taking from the lizard. That they're still interconnected, and there's plenty to go around, and they are, the redwoods creating the shady coolness for the salamander to be able to exist in the stream. And it's so interconnected and interwoven. It's not like, okay, someone has to go without in order for others to have more. That's all still within the construct of supremacy, because that's all rooted in like, I'm supreme, I'm better than, and I deserve more. And that's all driven by fear and lack and scarcity, which is like a survival instinct that is just miswired, is saying, in order to survive, I need to have more than everyone, and I need to be better than everyone. And that's just not true. I don't think it is. I mean, we can test, but I think the test is here. I think the test is look at our late stage capitalism and everything in our world right now. I think that is the test that's why I think that this survival instinct is miswired, and it's something that lives so deep in us. And, how do we work with that to actually see that we are safe and we can be safe and we can survive and even thrive without having to follow through on this urgent impulse? And that's a really weird gray zone.
Yeah, when you're talking about, the nervous system and how it, can manifest in the way of like, I need more than you, more, that, really also touches on like our consumption practices and capitalism, and kind of what you were talking about earlier, which is like having to like still like work in this machine. And how do you do that when it feels so wrong, and that there could be such a better way? But yeah, just in general of like, I want to hear more about like the nervous system.
I could talk more, but yeah, and like that's sort of how could we do something different? I don't know. That's just, it's something is a current question for me and my peers and my friends and family, and this is the edge, because we can't just abandon everything. Like everyone seems to have this fantasy of like, okay, let's just have our homestead and our compounds and like grow flowers and food and be happy together. But the reality of it is so much dysfunction, and land costs a lot of money, and it's a lot of work to run a homestead and to survive on your own. And it's probably very expensive, and it takes it's a long, huge learning curve. And there's all these like realities that just come in and crush the dream. And that's what, I have not found that having a clear idea of exactly what I'm striving for, like that act of striving itself is also kind of a grasping of the survival instinct that thinks it needs to do something in order to survive, versus just expression and being moved towards something. This is where I can just, gets into my whole, like, my ideologies of how does the universe function and my constructs. But I'm thinking of, I don't know what it is that life will look like or be different than this. But I do know that as I learn to discern what is that threat response, that survival instinct that says I have to do something in order to survive, I've learned to recognize that, and I've learned to evaluate whether that's true or not, and then to help that survival instinct also just come into what's more true. So an example would be if, like, for me, I felt like I was responsible for everybody else's misery, and if I didn't solve all of their problems and their misery, then it wasn't worth them paying me for a service or a product. And that was my, like, core money wounds. And my survival instincts made it feel like, oh my God, if I don't solve all of somebody's problems for them, then it's not even worth them paying me like $1. You know, it's like I've failed them. And that means that I also am going to die. Like that's what my body says. And so that's just not true. And even though cognitively in my mind and my thoughts, I know that's not true, I had to work with the impulse and the sensations, those survival instincts and how they show up in my body for my body to catch up with that and to see that too. And I think that's this huge gap in our modern society is we're all so cognitive, we're all so mental, and we're so disconnected from our body, and our bodies are not being supported for the animal natures of how they react to threats and how they need to feel safe. And we just don't know how to navigate our nervous systems. And that's something I've been, intuition was my gateway into that. Learning intuition and psychic development and all of that was my gateway into that world, learning how to navigate subtle energies and work in the etheric realms. But then all of that led, you and I co-created Earthspeak, and we co-created not just with each other, but with nature and spirit as our guides and our community as our guides. And I think that was such a cool experience because we didn't know exactly what it was going to become. We had a vision and we had an inspiration and we had enough tangibility from talking with each other and the spirit of the business and people that we met to put something into form. But it was an ongoing conversation that evolved. It was a co-creation conversation that evolved. And in that, the following that thread, instead of creating some big picture of exactly what we have to do and reaching that and striving for that at all costs, which would be more like a startup of like a tech startup or something. Like, okay, we have to become this big multi-million-dollar tech startup and we have to get investors and we have to do like, here's the formula. We didn't do that. We said, what's showing up present for us now? We went on that intuitive development path. And that, just following that, even though we didn't know all the answers and we still don't know all the answers, it brought us so much more richness and healing in our lives. And it brought me and you to trauma healing and to somatics and to being more embodied and to being able to navigate the nervous system. And now that we've been brought that, we get to amplify that and see what that then brings us. And so I think it's, to me, the way forward, I'm not saying this is how everyone has to do it, but my personal way forward is being in connection and conversation with my body, which is nature, which is earth, which is spirit, which is me and my ancestors and the future. Like like our bodies are so much so being in my body, which is also the present moment. That's where the present moment's happening, is in my body and in my senses. And then being in conversation with the other people in my life that I'm co-creating with, and not abandoning my own self, my own needs, and not abandoning theirs, but finding our pathway to both be well and nurtured and served. And that's like, whew, so different than capitalists. I take from you, you take from me, and it will even out. It's like, no, I give to you and you give to me, and together we have more now. We've created something new and different and more. And I think I hope what I'm saying, when I interview people, they're always like, oh, I rambled so much. And they're like, I hope it made sense. And so I feel exactly the same way right now, because I'm just kind of going on this thread here, but it's a whole different, does that make sense, Shawna?
Yeah. And I
are there any confusing points too? Because if there are, I can unpack that.
No, but I also know you well enough to where I think I could kind of like bring it into terms of like a lot of what you're speaking of is finding the capacity.
Definitely.
The capacity to explore things. Like I was thinking,
and I'm going to pause and say what capacity even means, because I'm sure that might be a new term for some people, but capacity is like how much ability do you have in your body to handle charge, to handle activation, to handle strong emotions or feelings running through you, whether that's excitement or fear? How much energy do you have to put out into the world? You know, how much what is the edge of you can think of an ecosystem has a capacity, a field, a garden bed has a capacity. How many plants can you plant in it? You know, and when you plant too many and you don't put compost back into the soil, you know, and if you overplant the bed, then you're not going to have a healthy garden. If you don't put compost back in the soil, you know, you're diminishing the soil's capacity to grow. So our capacity is based on like how much can our systems handle and feel safe until our threat responses are activated and we go into survival mode, fight, flight, freeze mode. That's what capacity would mean.
Right. And like getting to a point to where we don't have to react from a trauma response, but instead we're reacting from who we are in that moment in a way that is like coming from a place of wholeness, I think.
Safety. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that totally makes sense.
And I think that that's what we need to do. That's a starting point. That's like foundational level 1 is like, okay, how do we be in our own bodies and in our own capacity, and then work with each other's capacities and work with the capacity of the land. And capacity is itself a constraining factor. And we're all overriding capacity all the time, overriding the capacity of the land, overriding the capacity of our bodies, overriding other people's capacities with our bulldozing or expectations or steamrolling or whatever. It's just, we are in one big messy soup of overriding. And that's where so much conflict happens too, because then everyone blames everyone else and they think we're all stuck in this freaking loop and it's all just to survive. And it's just like, we can survive. Yeah. And you're not bad or wrong for it, but yeah.
It's the fear of not having enough. It's whether that's food or power. A lot of what happens, you know, the causes of war is the fear that other people are going to gain too much power, and the fear of what happens when that happens. You know, who knew this could be such a like kind of ethereal thing, right? A lot of constructs, but it's like, what if we could drop the fear of like what it looks like when we drop power over dynamics? I think of the golden age, when like you could express yourself for the sake of expression. You didn't have to be afraid of being an artist, expressing yourself in a way that felt true, because everyone communed in an open-minded way.
Well, I would say, did everyone, or was it just for the people who were given privileged in a certain way in that time?
Definitely. I think more of what I'm seeing too is like dropping the fear of what it looks like to have power over judgment. That's what it was. Really being non-judgmental. And right, but that's different than discernment, and we've talked about this in the past too. So going into situations where not having an agenda, so you're not trying to assert your power, your will over someone else, and you're not going into a situation judgmental. You're going in open and with the capacity to truly listen and then react, or really express and like connect from an authentic place. So I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at in terms of like what it could look like to be in community where people have been able to cultivate and find that safety within themselves. And imagine what we could co-create when we're all existing from that space.
Right. And,
And that's the domino that we're hoping to inspire.
yes, I feel like we already have. And I think this is something too in the supremacy construct. I know for myself, I can feel like, okay, I have to be completely safe and completely free of that survival instinct threat response. And I have to be completely non-judgmental and I have to conquer it all. And that's another form. It's like, no, what is the little pocket of safety and connection, safety in yourself, safety connecting with others that you can start from? Because I know you and I have built Earthspeak from this. We've co-created Earthspeak from these places in ourselves, but it's our executions sometimes were expressed through our survival instincts, reactions, and threat responses. But we were always coming from this place of this intention and the best of our ability to come from this place of connection and safety and support. I think that's what's so beautiful about our relationship and about what's been created from our relationship. And I think it proves that, okay, we don't have to be completely perfectly figured out and there before we can do anything. It's like we start from the little tiny spark of where you are now and let that expand and grow. And that is going to, in itself, whatever that grows into is in itself going to bring you what helps you keep growing. That's what we've experienced at Earthspeak, just following the spark of this, not even knowing where it would take us or what exactly it was, but just feeling that call and answering that call to the best of our ability and being able to navigate conflict and make decisions and co-create and repair and experiment in that non-judgmental way has allowed more healing to emerge and more healing to emerge and more for us and for our community and for it's a ripple effect.
Yeah, and I think too, like, you had mentioned earlier, everyone has this like romanticized idea of like, I want to get a homestead and live on this commune and like do all these different things. But
I mean, I still want it.
I still want it too, but like, what happens when serious disagreements and like fundamental differences arise? And if you haven't been able to cultivate safety to be able to deal with that in like a productive way, it can dismantle, and it has completely like dismantled
all kinds of communities. Yeah.
But also the way we do business. Like, we've been able to come, get to a place where like we can communicate and be honest with each other about how we're feeling in a moment. And like, I can say, I can't do that right now. Like, it's just like there's this block, and you can say, well, don't worry, like I got it. Like, I feel like we have each other's back in a way, but we're not afraid to say like, I don't know how to do that right now, or I can't see a way forward in this. And being able to like utilize our skill sets in such a way that is symbiotic, I think.
Oh, heck yeah. And I didn't know that we didn't intend our conversation to go here, but I think it's so cool how it's come here because our evolution of Earthspeak is such a living example of experimenting and getting some things like really nailing it. Don't want to say right, but like some things connected and some things did not. And some of that is because, there's so many reasons, but we just keep experimenting and we've failed a lot, but those failures are way pale in comparison to the healing and the connection and the learning and evolution that this journey has brought us and that the capacity it's built in us. And I think it's cool. I think that, God, I don't know. I love the like meta-ness of how we've been co-creating and working in this way and experimenting and now we're kind of shining a light in some other areas and exploring and just having these exploratory conversations.
But that's the beauty of what it could look like when you're working on, something that feels purposeful, but not being afraid to step away so that you can have that capacity to come back and see things differently. Like,
Yeah.
sometimes, like, you're just so in it, you have to take a step back to see it see what wants to come up.
Uh-huh. And I will say one thing with Earthspeak that we've realized, it's been a while. I don't know. My sense of time is pretty bad. But we had to disconnect Earthspeak from being the thing that was responsible for our survival within the system. And I think that's really important at this point, that we don't put pressure on Earthspeak to provide for us in the ways that we need to have resources and money and support in the system. We have shifted our focus on where are we getting our survival from towards other means of making money, which are still in the system, but now we have this space that we've co-created and that we are learning, okay, this is a space that is free to emerge as it wants to be and evolve, as it's a space that is showing us the way as we show up. And there's no pressure on it. Yeah.
Like now, right, because we still do operate in the space of capitalism, like that's just where we are. It's very difficult to get away from
Right.
that. But it's like we now get to make these monetary decisions not based on fear, but instead based on like what feels right. Like we have always wanted to
Alignment.
support
Mhm.
our community and like do things that are impactful. And now like we're able to do that, which is nice. So still
Yeah.
not in the way that we, like it's nice to give Earthspeak this room to breathe and expand because as we covered earlier, we're human. We are, a species that we evolve and our co-creations need the same space to grow and evolve. And it's just
Mhm.
everything is so symbiotic.
Yeah. I think that sort of overlaps with art and how art, it shows us the way. We don't come to art with an agenda. Art shows us the way and it allows our creative expression to emerge. And then it evolves us and it evolves people it touches. And I think that's Earthspeak's more of an art. And of course, as we evolve in our conversations here and in whatever it's going to become, whatever it already is and what form it takes, really is maybe a better way of saying that. It still has needs, financial needs, but it's cool to be able to experiment with that because, it takes money to produce a thing and to put it out there and to host a thing on a server and to organize people and to send emails and to da-da-da-da. Like, it takes resources, but we can experiment with, okay, how is this thing itself going to be self-sustaining? And I don't know. It's going to be cool.
Is where community intertwines back.
Exactly.
Part of what we noticed, right? Like our whole thing is like this domino ripple effect of modeling, which is like you being like a singular person being able to live their life feeling liberated because now you have all the tools to get to that point, and then showing others what that could look like because you're living a life that's authentic to you, but being able to still come together as a community in a reciprocal relation. Because what we, noticed in like all sorts of communities that we were involved in outside of Earthspeak as well is I feel like social media has kind of primed us in this way where it's like very, very like um it's not equal give and take in the way that engagement can be. And so like I dream of this community where people are excited to show up, excited to have discourse with each other and connect with each other without being prompted, without an agenda, without posting for the likes, without posting for the oohs and the ahs, but just for the sake of connection, for the sake of trying to better yourself, better the life around you in all sort of factions. So we've set up this framework, but we want it to be very co-creative, co-collaborative, and like growing without us having to prompt that, if that makes sense.
Right. Letting the life flow through it. I think that's what you mean by bettering too, is like more coming more alive and connecting for the sake of that aliveness. And that's something that's so
fun.
Yeah, that's an inherent need in humans. We need it. And that's something that supremacy and capitalism don't recognize. It's something that they distort and extract from and feed off from for profit, and leaving everyone hungry for more, and thinking that if they just consume more, they'll get the thing that they're hungry for. But it's so freaking distorted. And so, like, square one, after running our community for years, we've seen that people crave connection, and yet they are so scared of connection. And so that's the very first step, is helping people rewire that survival instinct, that threat response that says connection is too scary. Even though I crave it so much, it's too scary. And like helping people find safety in connection. And that's step one. Like, there's safety in oneself, maybe is step 0, because square 0, we're our own square 0. And then step 1, okay, how do you feel? Like, so many people have come into our community and felt like that feeling. What even brings someone to the feeling of having connection? Well, that feeling emerges from feeling safe. And if you don't feel safe connecting with other people, if it feels scary connecting with other people, you're not going to get that feeling. But you can't just force your way into connecting with other people to get there. It's working with those threat responses, those survival instincts, to help them see that actually you're very safe and supported, and it's not, your life is not at risk by connecting with people. And this is, there's so much distortion because of these constructs and ideologies, and that leads us right back to like why we're talking about ideologies and constructs. They've led to all this distortion and disconnect.
Because we want to get to that place of fun and community, but we have to understand where we got, like, where we came from to get to where we are, so that we can do better.
Yeah, so that we can do more alive. We can, and I think I like, even in that word better, like, what does better even mean? Because is that a supremacist word? Is that better, this is the best? Or does it mean like, so we can be more alive? Like, better is so subjective. Yeah.
Even saying better, it's like,
do better.
Objective.
Yeah, exactly.
And what better means. Yeah.
Right? Which dish tastes better? Everyone's subjective based on their taste buds and histories. Right? That's the liberation, the more free, more alive, more expressed. And that all comes from being in that state of feeling like your survival is not at stake. Like, you are taken care of and supported, and you're safe and you're connected, and you have, you are not putting your life at risk by speaking your truth, acting your truth, by reacting truthfully. It takes, it's so much. But that, I think this is a good stopping point, because we're just going to go on and on. You and I could just go on. And so is there anything else that you want to kind of wrap up? I feel like I've wrapped up my piece.
No, I think it's just, we have to keep the conversation going. And it can be uncomfortable, but there's a way through it. There's a way to become liberated.
Yeah, and it starts with
let liberation bloom.
Yeah, let liberation bloom, and starting with that discomfort and realizing that it's not actually going to kill you. Beautiful. Well, thanks, Shawna, and thanks, listeners.
Thanks, Natalie.
Yeah.
Thanks to our listeners, especially if you're stuck around until now. Thank you.
I know, right? And to our collective members, you are part of this conversation and have made this, you're part of this evolution and co-creation. When we speak of that, that's you too. It's not just me and Shawna dictating here. It's like, we're just a voice piece, but you're also part of it. And I get so excited.
I know. And like seeing, like members of the collective having their own like plant business now. Oh my gosh. It's so
Cool.
cool. It's so beautiful to see what happens when parts of ourselves truly does liberate,
Yeah.
become liberated.
We have so much to talk about. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, if y'all are listening to this point, as Shawna said, thank you. And please let us know what came up for you. We've actually set up a link where we've asked a few questions, and if you're willing, you can answer them, and we're going to ask about like what really inspired you about this? What questions do you have? What was activating or charged, or what felt a little bit uncomfortable, or what objections do you have? Or where were we wrong in your opinion? Like, we'd love to hear. Like, this is a conversation, and we're not here to be supreme and be right and correct, but really to explore and engage and connect and share, what's been living and true inside of us, and hear how that lands.
To hear about a moment in your life where you recognized an ideology didn't feel aligned and right for you, and so you changed it despite what those around you felt and believed. So yeah, can't wait to
Yes.
hear and read a little bit about your lives.
Amazing. Bye for now.
Bye for now.
All the roads are windy.
Listen to over 200 free Earthspeak podcast episodes on your favorite podcast app, and visit earthspeak.love to learn about our collective community and workshops.